and its customers for intellectual distinction and teaching excellence. These lectures are titled The Art of War. Your lecturer is Professor Andrew R. Wilson. Dr. Wilson is Professor of Strategy and Policy at the U.S. Naval War College. He holds a BA in East Asian Studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a PhD in History and East Asian Languages from Harvard University. Professor Wilson has lectured on military history, strategic theory, and international security in nearly 24 countries and on 6 continents. He also has been interviewed on National Public Radio and appeared in a documentary on the History Channel. Lecture 1. The Origins of a Revolutionary Classic.
Let's start with a question. What do former Defense Secretary Don Rumsfeld, legendary basketball coach Pat Riley, and fictional mob boss Tony Soprano all have in common? They've all quoted from Sun Tzu's Art of War. But it doesn't stop there. The Art of War pops up in business school curricula, in advertising for the National Hockey League, and all across American pop culture, especially in movies and television. From Oliver Stone's Wall Street to the sitcom How I Met Your Mother. Now, one of my specialties is Chinese strategic thought, and in particular, the Art of War. I've read numerous translations of this classic, and I've gone word for word through the original in classical Chinese. Obviously, I'm fascinated by this book. Even so, it always surprises me just how popular it is, and how frequently it's invoked in everything from military strategy to sports and even in business. There's even a book out there that applies the Art of War to romantic relationships. Almost everyone has heard of the Art of War, millions of people have read it, and many people claim its immediate relevance to our daily lives. In fact, the great British military theorist Basil Littlehart described the Art of War as having an eternal freshness, a quality that transcends all time, all historical context. We'll be spending quite a bit of time on that eternal freshness. We'll examine cases of success and failure in war, in politics, in business, and in life in general. And we'll see how the principles of the Art of War have been applied and misapplied in all of these areas, right down to the present day. But before we jump into contemporary examples, we really need to orient ourselves to the historical context in which the book was written. Because while the Art of War definitely has a timeless appeal, it's still a product of a unique time and a unique place. We need to learn a few things about that time and place if we wish to truly understand this timeless and universal classic. And that's what we'll be doing in this lecture. I'm not saying that only somebody with an encyclopedic knowledge of ancient China can understand this book. What I am saying is that a little knowledge of the tectonic shifts that were taking place at the time this book was written will make you a better educated consumer of its theoretical and practical content. It will also help you appreciate that this book is a lot more than a contemporary pop culture fad, and that, in fact, it's a historically significant landmark in the evolution of strategic thought. But before I get into that, I'm going to let you in on a couple of secrets. The first secret is that the name of the book is not really The Art of War. Rather, Sun Tzu Bing Fa, its Chinese title, which I'm pronouncing in modern Mandarin, is more accurately translated as Sun, a surname, Tzu, the masters, Bing, military, and Fa, method. Sun Tzu Bing Fa, Master Sun's military methods. So who is this Master Sun? He was a Chinese general whose given name was Sun Wu, and he lived at the end of the 6th century BC. But, and here's the second secret, Sun Wu didn't actually write the book. Instead, what's happening is that an anonymous 4th century author has appropriated Sun Wu's military credentials to argue that people have to radically rethink the military methods. But the fact that Sun Wu wasn't the actual author shouldn't make you question the book's value and insight. Rather, this appropriation of Sun Wu's military credentials was absolutely crucial to the argument that the book is trying to make. We'll see why that is a little later on. Now that I've shared those 2 secrets with you, I should probably make one other note. During these lectures, I may sometimes refer to the Art of War simply as the Sun Tzu. This is sort of academic shorthand, but there's no mystery in it. If you hear me say the Sun Tzu, that's just another way of saying the Art of War. So let's recap. Sun Tzu Bing Fa, which you can still call the Art of War, that's okay, was composed sometime toward the end of the 4th century BC. But the wisdom in its pages is attributed to Sun Wu, who lived 2 centuries earlier, at the end of the 6th century BC. We can't trace the maxims in the Art of War directly to Sun Wu, but the life and martial feats of General Sun, the man that we call Sun Tzu or Master Sun, comprise the backstory of this classic of strategic thought. And this backstory isn't just about Sun Wu. It's also about the transformation of society, the transformation of the political system, and the transformation of war in ancient China. To understand these transformations, we need to go back even further than the life of Sun Wu, all the way back to the 8th century BC. At that time, China was ruled by a dynasty called the Zhou, spelled Z-H-O-U, Zhou. But in fact, the Chinese political order was more like a feudal confederation. While the Zhou kings had a lot of ritual and cultural importance, in other words, soft power, they didn't have much in the way of military and economic power. That hard power tended to be concentrated in the hands of the rulers of the allied states that surrounded the Zhou. But even those states tended to be feudal confederations. For example, a state might be ruled nominally by a duke, but beneath him, there might be dozens of virtually independent aristocratic clans. That system limited the power of individual states because the duke did not actually rule the entire territory. It also limited the war-making capacity of these dukedoms. To understand that, let's consider an analogy. Suppose I'm the Duke of New Jersey, and I want to go to war against New York. To do that, I have to persuade the barons of Bergen and Burlington, the marquises of Morris, Monmouth, and Mercer, and the counts of Cumberland, Cape May, and Camden to show up with their personal armies on the appointed day. And if they do show up, they're also going to be bringing their personal interests and their personal vendettas to the battlefield. For example, the Baron of Bergen might be much more interested in seeking out his blood enemy, the Count of Cattaraugus, and in doing battle with him, much more interested in that than he is in obeying my orders, even though I'm his Duke. And the Duke of New York will face a similar set of problems. And this was what war was like in 8th century China. You'd have 2 or more of these confederations. They'd only campaign in certain seasons to make sure the weather was good, to make sure that the ground was dry and hard. The battles themselves would be highly ritualized. They would involve the reading of omens, the announcement of elaborate personal challenges, and the articulations of the justification for the war. And combat itself would generally be between armies of chariot-mounted aristocrats. That might involve a few thousand men on both sides. And yet war, while small in scale, was actually central to the identity of the Chinese aristocracy. The battlefield was where they spilled the blood of their enemies and honored their ancestors. Battle was about ritual. It was about glory. It was about vengeance. These political and military conditions begin to change in the mid-7th century BC, most notably in the northern state of Qi, Q-I, pronounced Qi. The rulers of Qi were famous for their martial prowess and had regularly been called upon to defend the northern frontiers. A high state of military readiness in Qi had in turn driven institutional innovations that allowed the rulers of Qi to tap the military potential of the population. For one, the dukes of Qi bought out or eliminated the lower aristocratic fiefdoms. They transformed Qi from a loose confederation into a much more unified state. They also established a bureaucracy that could systematically collect taxes and draft manpower. And finally, Qi established a military tradition that emphasized the talent of commanders over their noble pedigree. So in the course of a generation, Qi became one of the dominant states in ancient China. Its ruler was granted the title of Ba, or hegemon, a kind of supreme warlord and enforcer within the Chinese world order. But transformation can also migrate. So as other Chinese states start to adopt these innovations from Qi, we see better bureaucratic organization. We also see warfare becoming bigger and better organized. Sun Wu, the general to whom the art of war is attributed, was born and raised in Qi in the 6th century BC. So he was steeped in these bureaucratic and military models, and these military methods. But by Sun Wu's time, Qi was in decline, and the experts of Qi were looking for other rulers who might adopt their lessons. This is how Sun Wu comes to the court of King Helu, the ruler of the southern state of Wu. We can tell already that King Helu is an ambitious ruler because he calls himself king. Up to this point, there had only been one king, the king of the Zhou. But some rulers were trying to claim equality with and maybe superiority over the Zhou, to supplant the Zhou. Helu is one of those rulers, but so is the king of his western neighbor, Chu. So what we have is a struggle for dominance in southern China between the states of Wu and Chu. It's in this context that General Sun Wu comes to the attention of King Helu. Like anyone looking for work, Sun Wu has to have an interview. And this was a truly memorable interview. In the audience chamber, the king challenges Sun Wu to prove that he can turn anyone, even a woman, into a soldier. Sun Wu says yes he can. And he sets up a demonstration with a group of the king's concubines. When the women giggle instead of obeying orders, Sun Wu has the 2 senior concubines decapitated. After that, the rest of the women fall in line and obey perfectly. With one stroke, Sun Wu demonstrated the very serious business of war and the new realities of mass warfare, a reality where discipline and obedience were everything. Chilled, but ultimately convinced, King Helu gave Sun Wu command of one of his armies. Sun Wu trained and equipped that force of some 30,000 men in the methods of Qi. And in the war that followed, he used that modest force to harass, to wear down, and ultimately to defeat the much larger army of Chu. Sun Wu was therefore instrumental in the meteoric rise of the state of Wu. In fact, his defeat of Chu made King Hulu the hegemon. Over time, however, Sun Wu became disillusioned with Wu's rulers, and he resigned. Without Sun Wu, the state of Wu was gradually worn down in a series of wars until it was finally wiped out by the same foe that Sun Wu had defeated a generation before. And the destruction of Wu ushered in an age of cutthroat competition between the remaining Chinese states. This competition in turn accelerated the transformation of warfare in ancient China. In the Warring States period, which spans the 5th to the 3rd centuries BC, we see ever larger and better organized states. By the 4th century, only 7 very large states remained. This is when the Sun Tzu, when the Art of War was written, around 330 to 320 BC. So the Art of War was composed in a context where multiple states were large and lethal enough to compete for control of all of China. And we have every reason to believe that each of these states could raise an army comprising 100, even 2 or 3 or 400,000 men. We've all seen images of China's famous terracotta warriors, the 7,000-man army for the afterlife, guarding the tomb of the king, who succeeded in unifying all of China in the late 3rd century. Those warriors are a graphic reminder of the centrality of war in ancient China, the scale of the military, but also the bureaucratic sophistication of ancient China's warring states. The Art of War gives us an even more precise insight into the situation. Military operations, Chapter 2 begins, generally require 1,000 combat chariots, 1,000 transport wagons, and arms and armor for 100,000 men. All told, these expenses amounted to 1,000 pieces of gold a day. That would have been 60% of the state's revenue. War had become very big business in ancient China. To this point, we've been tracing the dramatic changes that occurred in China between the 8th and the 4th century BC. What we have are transformations in the scale, scope, and expense of war. Huge armies armed with standardized weapons requiring huge logistical support systems. The problem was that despite all of these radical changes, old notions about command and the traditional emphases on personal valor and blood vendetta still prevailed. Anachronistic notions about the purpose of war tied to the incredible new means of warfare was a very, very dangerous combination. Think back to the story of Wu. Sun Wu provided the king of Wu with the methods to dramatically increase his military power, and with the leadership to use that power effectively. In the hands of Sun Wu, the military was the guarantor of Wu's power and prosperity. But in the hands of lesser men, men bent on revenge or personal glory, the military was wasted and Wu was ultimately destroyed. This is why the very first line of the Art of War reads, "The military is the greatest affair of the state, the province of life and death, the path to survival or ruin." So by the 4th century BC, all the remaining Chinese states confront a paradox. New and incredibly lethal military capabilities, but dangerously anachronistic notions about what the military was for and how to use it. The Art of War confronts this paradox head-on by offering a new way of thinking about military command and strategy, a way of thinking that is appropriate to the military and political realities of its time. Moreover, the author of the Sun Tzu is trying to sell this new model to the ruler of one of the states contending for ultimate hegemony in 4th century China. Think about this. The Art of War is an argument for military command based on merit, not birth. And it's very, very critical of anachronistic notions about what war is all about. In other words, it argues that the military should only be used to bring tangible benefits to the state, not in the pursuit of glory or vengeance. But who are the people most likely to think in old-fashioned ways about war? Well, simple. It's the hereditary rulers of the warring states themselves. The Art of War tells us, and I'm quoting here, 100 victories in 100 battles is not the supreme excellence. To reject battle and yet force the submission of the enemy's troops, that is the supreme excellence. Simply put, it's better to win without fighting. To the ruler of a warring state, however, war and combat might be ends in themselves, but the Sun Tzu views them as just means to an end. To borrow a phrase from contemporary business, our author is trying to be a change agent, to transform attitudes, to optimize utility. But as any change agent knows, transformation can be a hard sell, and sometimes you have to go to rhetorical extremes. This is why the structure of the Sun Tzu is alternately relentlessly methodical, but also boldly provocative. It relentlessly hammers home the point that thinking about the nature and purpose of war has not caught up to the realities of warfare. But it also provocatively tells its audience, those aristocratic rulers, that they are a big part of the problem. This role as change agent puts the author of this book in the company of the other great strategic thinkers, such as Machiavelli and Karl von Clausewitz, and in the company of great business leaders like Henry Ford and Steve Jobs. People who are trying to change attitudes and processes to better fit their own radically changed and changing circumstances. The change that the art of war is pushing is based on two interrelated arguments. The first is that the sole purpose for the existence and the use of the military is to increase the wealth and power of the state. Simply put, it is about profit. And I quote, "If it does not profit the state, do not use the military." The second argument is that the general must have complete autonomy. As the art of war puts it, and again as I quote, "The ruler who has able generals and who does not interfere in their affairs will be victorious." These two core arguments are amplified when we understand the backstory about Qi, the backstory about the transformation of warfare, and the backstory about the rise and fall of Wu. Knowing that full story adds layers of depth, complexity, and context to our reading of the art of war. Of course, anybody who read the art of war in ancient China would know the backstory and would recall the tragedy of Wu. But there's also a really neat trick going on here that adds some shock value. Traditionally, the rise and fall of Wu was viewed as a kind of cautionary morality tale. Ambition and revenge get the better of the rulers of Wu, and this once great power is utterly destroyed. But the author of The Art of War, by attributing this book to Sun Wu, is shifting the focus from morality to the military. We can get a sense of this shift from the moral to the martial from the fact that this book is attributed to Master Sun, not just Sun Wu, General Sun Wu. Master is an incredibly loaded term. Initially, master, pronounced zi in Chinese, referred to a low-level aristocrat. It was actually the Confucians, led by Kung Fu Zi, Master Kung Fu, whom we call Confucius, who first started using zi to claim equality with the hereditary nobility. This equality was based on their learning, not on their birth. Soon other schools, like the Taoists, are picking it up and calling their leading lights Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. But until the 4th century, the title of Master of Zi was restricted to people talking about morality and philosophy and statecraft. The Art of War is the first book to claim that military affairs are a fit topic for a master. So in the same way that the early Confucians claimed to be masters to stand equal with the hereditary nobility, here we have a military expert claiming to stand equal with the great moral philosophers. But the similarity between the moral teachings of the early masters and the hard-nosed realism of Master Sun ends there. In fact, the claim in The Art of War might be even more ambitious than the early masters would offer. After all, the military is described as the greatest affair of the state, supplanting things like sacred rituals and the moral cultivation of the rulers. It helps also that Sun Wu lived at the same time as Confucius, since this is a culture where the older the source, the more legitimate it is. So now that you understand the transformations taking place at the time this book was written, and the further changes in attitudes and processes that our author, our master, is trying to drive, we can turn our attention to the structure and content of the book. So let's pick up a copy of the Sunzi and give it a once-over. The first thing you notice is that it's pretty short. The original is only about 9,000 characters. To put that in perspective, I could read the whole thing to you in just 2 of our half-hour sessions. If your translation has a little more heft, that's because it's been padded out with introductory essays, glossaries, maps, and photos. But the translation of the original text itself is still very, very lean. The standard version of The Art of War comprises 13 chapters attributed to Master Sun, each one beginning with the line, "Master Sun said." And remember here why calling Sun Wu master is so loaded. Given that they're the words of a master, many of the maxims appear to be statements of truth, free from extensive supporting analysis and historical examples. In addition, the Sunzi is written in a very terse style. As such, individual passages read as discrete pearls of wisdom that are easily divorced from the rest of the text. For example, and I quoted this before, the supreme excellence is to achieve victory without resort to battle. That may sound great, but when taken out of the context of the book and taken out of the historical context we've just reviewed together, a statement like that is about as useful as advising a rookie Wall Street investor to buy low and sell high. Many versions of The Art of War also intersperse commentaries with the original text, filling in with examples where the original simply states a maxim. This is a really perfect formula for misinterpretation. In the first place, the original offers little in the way of context or concrete examples, so translators just fill in their own. To make matters worse, the commentaries disrupt the flow of the chapters. That's why we need to be careful when we start reading this book. As you read it, try to read it as a coherent manifesto. Watch for how the arguments build and for how the language is consistent and purposeful. My approach when reading and teaching this book is to pay very close attention to how the author defines and uses specific terms. Whenever I come across a particular term later in the book, I think of it as a hyperlink, right? If you click on it, it will take you back to the original definition. Paying attention to these definitions is also very important because in classical Chinese, as in any language, words can have a lot of different meanings. And you need to make sure you understand which meaning is being used at that time. As an example, let's look at a word that appears only twice in all of The Art of War. That word is benevolence, pronounced run in Chinese. Benevolence is a core concept in ancient Chinese philosophy. and especially in Confucianism, where its meaning is very close to our understanding of benevolence, right? Kindness, generosity, charity, putting the interests of others before your own. So when the Sun Tzu tells us that benevolence is one of the 5 virtues of the general, along with wisdom, sincerity, courage, and discipline, we might be inclined to read into that term a Confucian interpretation. But in fact, if you look to the only other place in the book where that word appears, that's in chapter 13 on the use of spies, we see there that the utmost benevolence is equated with the general's willingness to pay spies and traitors in the enemy's camp top dollar for useful information. Trust me, that's a very different interpretation of benevolence from the one offered by the Confucians. So as you read the book, stay attuned to how the author, especially in chapter 1, defines different terms. For now, let's briefly look at the content of the 13 chapters that comprise the art of war. Chapter 1 identifies the critical calculations that must be made prior to war, what Sun Tzu refers to as knowing the enemy, knowing ourselves, knowing the weather, and knowing the terrain. So from the very start, we see an emphasis not on heroics, but on intellect and analysis. Those are the qualities that are necessary to train and employ the transformed military. Chapter 2 lays out the costs and dangers of mobilizing a state for war. This is where the Sun Tzu alerts us to the risks of getting bogged down in protracted military operations. Remember what happened to the state of Wu. But we need to ask ourselves if protraction is always bad. After all, George Washington employed a Fabian strategy, a strategy that required protraction. But remember again the historical context. 2 Chinese warring states are like heavyweight boxers. They've pummeled each other for 15 rounds. They don't have the strength to defend themselves against a third boxer, that is, another Chinese state, who jumps into the ring. Chapter 3 of the Sun Tzu lays out a continuum from the most to the least efficient strategies. They are first attacking the enemy's strategy, then attacking his alliances, then attacking his armies, and last attacking his cities. Notice that attacking the enemy's army comes third on the list. In other words, actual combat implies a failure to find more efficient strategies. Remember, war in 4th century China is radically different than war in 8th century China. And in war, as in business, change requires adaptation. Chapters 4 through 11 really get into the nuts and bolts of military doctrine and operations. In these chapters, we're treated to the nearly supernatural skills of the commander in organizing his troops, maneuvering the army, exploiting the weather, exploiting the terrain, gathering intelligence, shaping his forces, and manipulating the enemy. We'll be spending a lot of time on those skills in lectures 2 through 4. Chapter 12 is a delightfully dispassionate discussion on how and when to set fire to people and things. This is a hard-nosed book. Finally, chapter 13 explains how all this mastery of the military instrument is possible through the deft use of spies. We'll discuss this at length in lecture 5. So you see how the art of war is trying to change ancient Chinese attitudes toward war and strategic leadership. Whereas the aristocrats were born to command, Sun Tzu's general has earned his command based on his intellect and on his mastery of the new methods of war. And that's where we'll turn to in the next lecture, to the personal and professional attributes of the commander and to the methods by which that commander can transform a mass of illiterate peasants into an infinitely responsive instrument. In the meantime, I hope that I've convinced you that reading The Art of War in light of the historic transformations that were happening in ancient China actually makes the book a lot more interesting, a lot more vital. So look around at other contemporary or historic transformations. Things like the ongoing information technology revolution today. Who survives? Who thrives? It's certainly not people like the ancient Chinese aristocracy that clung to dangerously outmoded ideas about strategy and leadership.
These lectures are part of the Great Courses. The Great Courses cover a broad array of university-level disciplines. The lectures in each course are either 30 or 45 minutes long. By listening for less than an hour a day, you can finish even the longest course in just weeks. Browse our catalog or website at thegreatcourses.com and imagine how much you could learn if you spent just 30 minutes a day for the next year in the best college classrooms in the world. The lecturers are university professors carefully selected by the Great Courses and its customers for intellectual distinction and teaching excellence. These lectures are titled The Art of War. Your lecturer is Professor Andrew R. Wilson. Dr. Wilson is Professor of Strategy and Policy at the U.S. Naval War College. He holds a BA in East Asian Studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a PhD in History and East Asian Languages from Harvard University. Professor Wilson has lectured on military history, strategic theory, and international security in nearly 24 countries and on 6 continents. He also has been interviewed on National Public Radio and appeared in a documentary on the History Channel. Lecture 1, The Origins of a Revolutionary Classic.
Let's start with a question. In these chapters, we're treated to the nearly supernatural skills of the commander in organizing his troops, maneuvering the army, exploiting the weather, exploiting the terrain, gathering intelligence, shaping his forces, and manipulating the enemy. We'll be spending a lot of time on those skills in lectures 2 through 4. Chapter 12 is a delightfully dispassionate discussion on how and when to set fire to people and things. This is a hard-nosed book. Finally, Chapter 13 explains how all this mastery of the military instrument is possible through the deft use of spies. We'll discuss this at length in Lecture 5. So you see how the art of war is trying to change ancient Chinese attitudes toward war and strategic leadership. Whereas the aristocrats were born to command, Sun Tzu's general has earned his command based on his intellect and on his mastery of the new methods of war. And that's where we'll turn to in the next lecture, to the personal and professional attributes of the commander and to the methods by which that commander can transform a mass of illiterate peasants into an infinitely responsive instrument. In the meantime, I hope that I've convinced you that reading The Art of War in light of the historic transformations that were happening in ancient China actually makes the book a lot more interesting, a lot more vital. So look around at other contemporary or historic transformations. Things like the ongoing information technology revolution today. Who survives? Who thrives? It's certainly not people like the ancient Chinese methods by which that commander can transform a mass of illiterate peasants into an infinitely responsive instrument. In the meantime, I hope that I've convinced you that reading The Art of War in light of the historic transformations that were happening in ancient China actually makes the book a lot more interesting, a lot more vital. So look around at other contemporary or historic transformations. Things like the ongoing information technology revolution today. Who survives? Who thrives? It's certainly not people like the ancient Chinese